The night was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The small suburban house stood still under the pale glow of the streetlights, its windows dark, its rooms wrapped in the kind of silence that only comes at 2 in the morning. Inside, Margaret was asleep on the living room couch, a book resting on her chest, when a pounding on the door jolted her awake. At first she thought she was dreaming. The knocks were frantic, desperate, shaking the wooden frame. She stumbled to her feet, still half asleep, her heart hammering in her chest. When she opened the door, the world seemed to stop. There stood her daughter, Emily. But this was not the Emily she knew, the young woman with a bright smile and hopeful eyes. Instead, Emily's face was pale, her hair disheveled, and her clothes torn. Blood streaked her arms, and a crimson stain spread across her blouse. Her lips trembled as tears streamed down her face. "Mom, please, help me." Margaret froze. She wanted to scream to ask what had happened, but her body reacted before her mind did. She pulled Emily inside, slamming the door shut, and guided her trembling daughter toward the couch. Her hands shook as she tried to grab a towel, to clean the blood, to do anything. "Who did this to you? Tell me, Emily. Who hurt you?" Margaret's voice cracked, heavy with panic. Emily buried her face in her mother's chest, sobbing uncontrollably. For a long moment she couldn't speak. Her breaths came in short, sharp gasps as if each word was trapped behind a wall of fear. Finally she whispered a name Margaret never expected. It was Daniel. The world tilted. Daniel, her son-in-law, the man Margaret had welcomed into her family, the man who had promised to love and protect her daughter, the man she thought she could trust. Margaret felt as though the floor had collapsed beneath her. How could this be true? How could the man she had defended in so many conversations, the man she had believed in, be the one who caused this? But there was no denying the truth. The blood, the terror in Emily's eyes, the bruises already forming on her arms. It all painted a horrifying picture. As Margaret held her daughter, a storm began brewing inside her. Shock, anger, despair, all colliding into one unbearable truth. Her daughter was not safe, and the danger was closer than she had ever imagined. But what could she do now? Call the police? Confront Daniel? Hide Emily away? Every choice seemed impossible, and yet she knew she had no time to hesitate. For the first time, Margaret realized this was not just a mother's nightmare. This was war. Before we continue with Emily's journey and the truth that will shatter everything Margaret believed about her family, I want to ask you something. What would you do if your child showed up at your door in the middle of the night, bruised and bleeding? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you won't miss the next chapters of this heartbreaking and powerful story. The hospital's fluorescent lights were harsh, almost blinding, as Margaret sat beside her daughter's bed. Emily lay there quietly, an IV attached to her arm, her skin pale under the white sheets. The doctors had treated her wounds, cuts along her arms, a fractured rib. But it wasn't the physical injuries that worried Margaret the most. It was the silence. Emily stared at the ceiling, her lips pressed tightly together. She seemed trapped somewhere between exhaustion and fear, as if even here, surrounded by nurses and security cameras, she wasn't truly safe. Margaret gently brushed her daughter's hair away from her face. "Sweetheart, you don't have to be afraid anymore. You're safe here, tell me everything. Please." Emily's eyes filled with tears. Her voice trembled as she finally broke the silence. "It was Daniel, Mom. He lost his temper again. He said I was making him look weak in front of his friends. He didn't stop this time." Margaret felt her chest tighten, her nails digging into her palm. Again? That word echoed in her mind like a cruel revelation. How many times had this happened before? How many bruises had Emily hidden? How many excuses had she made while Margaret had smiled and believed everything was fine? Her memory betrayed her. Flashes of Emily wearing long sleeves in the summer, her nervous laughter when asked about small injuries, the way Daniel's eyes sometimes flashed with something darker than charm. All the signs had been there, but Margaret hadn't wanted to see them. "I thought he loved me," Emily whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought if I just tried harder, he would stop. But tonight, I thought he was going to kill me." Margaret swallowed hard, her throat burning. She wanted to promise Emily that everything would be okay, but the truth was heavier than any words she could find. Daniel wasn't just a bad husband, he was dangerous. When the doctor returned with a clipboard, Margaret pulled herself together enough to ask, "Doctor, do we need to report this? To the police?" The doctor hesitated, then nodded. "In cases like this, it's strongly recommended. Your daughter is in danger if she goes back." Margaret's heart pounded. Report Daniel? The man who had charmed their entire family, the man who worked in their community and was respected by so many? How would people react? Would they believe Emily, or side with Daniel, who had always seemed so perfect on the outside? But as she looked at her daughter, fragile and broken in that hospital bed, Margaret knew one thing. Silence was no longer an option. She squeezed Emily's hand. "We're going to the police, sweetheart. We'll fight this. You're not alone anymore." For the first time that night, Emily closed her eyes and let out a shaky breath. It wasn't relief, not yet, but it was trust. And that trust gave Margaret the strength to face what was coming next. But Margaret had no idea just how ugly the fight would become. The police station smelled faintly of coffee and paperwork, the air heavy with the weight of other people's tragedies. Margaret sat close to her daughter, her arm protectively wrapped around Emily's shoulders as they waited to be called in. Emily looked small, her hands trembling in her lap, her eyes darting nervously at every sound. When the officer finally ushered them into a room, Emily's voice cracked as she began recounting the night. Every detail was painful, every memory cutting deeper than the last. Margaret wanted to cover her daughter's ears, to shield her from having to relive the nightmare. But she knew this testimony was necessary. The officer took notes, his brow furrowed. When Emily finished, he looked up with a seriousness that made Margaret's stomach turn. "We'll open a case immediately," he said. "But I'll be honest with you, Daniel has no record. He's well regarded in this town. People will find it hard to believe." Margaret's blood boiled. Hard to believe? What was hard to believe about the bruises on her daughter's body, the broken rib, the fear etched into her face? But she bit her tongue. She knew anger wouldn't help now. In the days that followed, the storm began. Daniel's family accused Emily of lying, saying she was trying to ruin his life. Neighbors whispered when Margaret went to the market, their eyes filled with judgment. Even some relatives suggested she should keep this private, for the sake of appearances. Margaret wanted to scream. Appearances? How could anyone care about appearances when her daughter had nearly lost her life? Emily, meanwhile, struggled with guilt. "Maybe I should drop the charges," she whispered one night. "What if no one believes me? What if he comes after us?" Margaret took her daughter's hands firmly. "Listen to me, Emily. You survived. That's already proof of your strength. But if we stay silent, he wins. He'll keep hurting you, and maybe someone else too. We can't let him." Those words seemed to ignite something inside Emily. She still shook. She still cried. But she stopped talking about giving up. Step by step, she began to push forward, with her mother's unwavering presence beside her. The first hearing arrived, and Margaret sat in the courtroom, her heart pounding as Daniel walked in. He was dressed in a neat suit, his hair combed perfectly, his expression calm and confident, as though this was just another day in his charmed life. He even smiled at some acquaintances sitting in the gallery, as if nothing had happened. Margaret clenched her fists. She could almost hear the whispers around her. Such a nice young man. Could this really be true? But then Emily entered, her face pale yet determined. She stood before the judge, her voice trembling but clear, and told her story. Every word cut through the lies Daniel had built around himself. Every truth was a blow to the mask he wore. And Margaret, watching her daughter stand against the man who had broken her, felt a fierce pride burning through her fear. Yet she knew this was only the beginning, because Daniel was not about to give up easily. The weeks that followed were a blur of court dates, statements, and sleepless nights. Margaret barely recognized her own life anymore. Her once quiet days had turned into a constant battle, fighting lawyers, confronting whispers, and most of all, keeping her daughter safe. Daniel, meanwhile, played his role perfectly. To the public, he was the devoted husband wronged by false accusations. He appeared calm, polished, and persuasive. Some people even praised him for keeping his dignity during the scandal. The lies spread quickly, poisoning the air around them. But then something happened that changed everything. One evening, Margaret received a phone call. A trembling voice on the other end introduced herself as Rachel. She hesitated before speaking. Her words rushed as though she was afraid of being overheard. "I saw what's happening with Emily, and I need you to know, she's not the first. Daniel, he did the same to me. Years ago." Margaret's heart nearly stopped. Another victim. Proof that Emily wasn't alone, that Daniel's violence was not a one-time mistake but a pattern, a hidden monster behind the mask of charm. Rachel agreed to testify, though her fear was palpable. Soon after, 2 more women came forward with their own stories, each one different, yet all carrying the same thread of pain and silence. When Margaret told Emily, her daughter's eyes filled with both horror and relief. "I wasn't crazy," she whispered. "It wasn't my fault." That moment was small but powerful. For the first time, Emily seemed to stand taller, as though the weight she carried had shifted slightly off her shoulders. The next hearing was different. This time, Daniel didn't look so composed. As Rachel spoke, her hands shaking but her voice firm, his mask began to crack. The judge's eyes narrowed. The gallery shifted uncomfortably. The perfect image of Daniel was crumbling piece by piece. Margaret squeezed Emily's hand. "You see? The truth always finds a way out." Still, the fight was far from over. Daniel's lawyer tried every tactic, discrediting witnesses, twisting words, painting Emily as unstable. The process was exhausting, draining them both emotionally and financially. Yet amidst the chaos, there were victories. Emily started therapy, where she slowly rebuilt her confidence. She began journaling her thoughts, sketching her feelings in drawings that Margaret often found tucked between the pages. Each one was raw, painful, but also proof that Emily was healing. One afternoon, Margaret walked into Emily's room and found her smiling softly at a drawing. It was of 2 women, one older, one younger, holding hands in the middle of a storm. Above them, dark clouds swirled, but in the distance, sunlight was breaking through. Margaret's throat tightened. "That's us, isn't it?" Emily nodded. "We're still in the storm, Mom, but I believe we'll see the sun." For Margaret, it was the most beautiful victory yet, because even though the battle wasn't over, her daughter was finding her strength again. But the greatest test was still ahead, the day the court would deliver its final decision. The morning of the final hearing was gray and cold, as if the sky itself understood the weight of what was about to unfold. Margaret and Emily sat together in the small waiting room outside the courtroom, their hands intertwined. Neither spoke much, but they didn't need to. Their silence was filled with all the words they had already shared during sleepless nights, long talks, and tearful embraces. Emily's breathing was uneven. She looked down at her trembling hands and whispered, "What if he walks away free, Mom? What if all of this was for nothing?" Margaret turned her daughter's face gently toward her. "Listen to me. No matter what happens today, you are already free. You found your voice, you stood up, and nothing can take that away from you." When the courtroom doors opened, the sound of the bailiff's announcement echoed against the high ceilings. Margaret and Emily walked in together, their steps small but determined. On the other side, Daniel was already seated. His suit was pressed, his hair perfectly combed, but something in his posture betrayed him. His shoulders were tight, his jaw stiff, his eyes restless. He no longer looked like the man who had walked into the first hearing with smug confidence. The room filled with whispers as people took their seats. Some were Daniel's supporters, family members, colleagues, neighbors who still clung to the image of him as a good man. Others were there for Emily, for the women who had finally found the courage to come forward. The tension was almost unbearable. When the judge entered, silence swept over the room. The decision would be read today. Margaret's heart pounded so violently she could barely hear the first words. She focused on Emily, who sat upright, her face pale but resolute. The judge's voice was steady, deliberate. After reviewing all testimonies, medical reports, and the evidence presented before this court, It is the conclusion that Daniel Matthews has engaged in repeated acts of domestic violence and coercive control against his wife, Emily Matthews, as well as patterns of abuse corroborated by additional witnesses. Therefore, this court finds the defendant guilty. The room erupted in a wave of murmurs, shock, disbelief, relief, anger. Margaret felt tears spill down her cheeks as she squeezed Emily's hand. She turned to her daughter, who sat frozen for a moment, her lips parted as though she hadn't heard correctly. Then Emily let out a shaky breath and whispered, "It's over." Her voice was so soft that Margaret barely heard it, but the meaning was louder than any shout. The nightmare had ended. Daniel's face hardened. He tried to maintain composure, but his mask was shattered. For years he had controlled, manipulated, and hidden his violence behind charm. But now, in front of everyone, he was no longer untouchable. The law had seen him for who he truly was. After the sentencing, Margaret and Emily stepped outside the courthouse together. The air felt different, lighter, freer, as though the world itself was breathing with them. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but Margaret kept her focus only on her daughter. Emily looked at the sky, her eyes glistening with tears. "I don't feel happy, not yet, but I feel like I can breathe again." Margaret wrapped an arm around her. "Healing takes time, sweetheart, but you've already taken the hardest step." In the weeks that followed, life slowly began to rebuild itself. Emily attended therapy sessions, where she confronted her trauma piece by piece. There were still nightmares, still moments when a sudden noise made her flinch, but there were also new beginnings. She started sketching again, filling her notebooks with drawings that told her story. Some dark, some hopeful. Margaret often found her sitting in the garden, her pencil moving gently across the page as sunlight bathed her face. One afternoon she noticed Emily working on a drawing of two women standing hand in hand under a stormy sky, with rays of sunlight breaking through the clouds. Margaret felt her throat tighten. "That's us, isn't it?" Emily smiled faintly. "Yes. The storm isn't over, but the sun is coming." Those words stayed with Margaret. They were a reminder that healing is not a single moment. It is a journey. But it was also proof that Emily was no longer broken. She was surviving. She was reclaiming her life. And Margaret knew that if love had the power to endure such darkness, it also had the power to build a future filled with light. Because in the end, this was not just a story of violence. It was a story of resilience, of courage, and of the unshakable bond between a mother and her child. A reminder to anyone listening that silence protects the abuser, never the victim, and that sometimes the strongest justice in the world is love that refuses to give up. Before we close this story, remember this: silence only protects the abuser, never the victim. If you or someone you know is facing violence, please reach out for help. You are not alone. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What part of Margaret and Emily's journey moved you the most? Your voice matters, so share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Together we can spread awareness, courage, and hope.